Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser here with Stacy Herbert. And it's time to turn to summer solutions regarding the disintegration of the American empire and all the deflation and debt collapse that entails. Charles Hugh Smith, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Glad to be here, as always.
All right, here's the first question. Collapsing empires have been some of the bloodiest times in human history. How do we navigate this transition to a post-empire for America?
Well, Max, I think we can start by saying the first step is to disentangle yourself from all the systems that are going to be eroding and collapsing. And that includes anything under the imperial control.
Yeah, but everything is controlled by how do you disentangle yourself from the gaping maw of a shark that has you in its jaws? I mean, it's everything. What do you mean?
Okay, well, I guess we can start with the kinds of money that the empire doesn't control completely, or that is locally controlled, and this can include precious metals, actual physical cash, cryptocurrencies, and basically goods and services that you can trade in a network that's local. And these kinds of things are difficult for the empire to control, and these are the kinds of things that arise once imperial control starts weakening or eroding. This is what we've seen from history.
Charles Hugh Smith, on your website, you talked about the fact that the American Empire is very similar to the Roman Empire. First, tell us how it is that we know that the American Empire is indeed an empire, it denies it's an empire, and how is it collapsing? What signs do you see that it is actually disintegrating other than us stating it is so?
Well, Stacy, that's a great question. And of course, the first reason why we know it's an empire is it denies it's an empire. But I think an empire is based on global reach, and it's also based on extracting a lot of resources from nations and regions beyond its home borders. That's what an empire is. And I see 8 factors, and I'm drawing upon many authors such as Homer Dixon, who wrote Upside of Down, and lots of people have written about the process of collapse. So I'm not claiming these are, new to me, but I've pulled out 8 factors that identify that characterize the decline of empires. And I'm just going to read them real quick here. And one is profound political disunity, like the powers that be start breaking into factions that are warring over, what to do about the decline of the empire. The other one is the rise of unproductive complexity, tens of thousands of regulations that no one can possibly keep track of, that sort of thing. The third is the erosion of those bearing the sacrifices. In other words, the people who are actually bearing the price of keeping the empire going, like mid-rank military officers, they're quitting in droves. Doctors and nurses under pressure in the healthcare system, quitting in droves. Number 4 is the decay of leadership. There's no really decisive leadership. It's one vested interest backing their candidate and that kind of thing. The 5th is the rise of bread and circuses, the rise of entertainment and that to distract the home audience and population from what's going on. The 6th is the decline of the ability to actually produce wealth. It's the reliance on financial trickery. 7 is the sclerosis that occurs when vested interests control everything in the empire. The common people have no say. And the last one is resource depletion and environmental damage. And I think we can see all of these in play in the USA.
And so when in the past empires have collapsed, whether it was the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, it's often been marked by very bloody sort of times and global depression. Are we going to see a similar situation? How do you think it will compare to those others?
Well, we can only hope that we can manage a less bloody transition than the collapse of previous empires. And it's partly where we are in the process of collapse. We could look at the Tang dynasty in China and the Roman Empire. They often took decades of relative peace while they sort of declined and eroded. So we can hope for that kind of gentle decline, shall we say. And there's history to support both cases, and let's hope we don't end up in World War III as the result, although that's certainly a possibility.
It seems as the American sort of hegemony, empire, whatever they want to call it, or whatever you want to call it, it seems like the last gasp of it is a rapid escalation of debt, that there's more and more debt. And you see that in the healthcare system, you see that in the education system, you see that in the global derivatives market. When that blows up, and I think everybody, whether they're huge investors or just the ordinary person, senses this is going to blow up. Obviously, this is part and parcel of the collapse of the empire. But how do you protect yourself, even if you choose, if you're able to manage not to go into debt? Like, how do you protect yourself from those who will be drowning in debt around you? Or what is the solution to, do we set up our transition economies, communes, like go somewhere out in the woods, become survivalists? How do you see that happening?
Well, that's an excellent question, Stacy, and I think we can, again, look to the history as for examples of what kind of money arises or becomes widespread after an empire collapses. And so, interestingly enough, the coinage issued by empires tends to last a lot longer than the actual empire. Spanish coins continued to be in common use and so on. And so we could look at, like, say, the US dollar, the actual physical dollars. There's only $1.3 trillion in currency in the world, and there's, 70 trillion in nominal US dollars or something like that. So actual physical cash will probably be a good source of value. Of course, precious metal coins have historically proven to retain their value. And beyond that, my little watchword is trust your network, not the state. And what that means is you can set up systems of informal credit where you say, I'll go do this for you, and you'll owe me X amount of hours or some equivalent good and service. And so the history of money suggests that these kinds of like informal chits are quite common. And in other words, local currencies. And these might arise, and there's been experiments like on the island of Guernsey, and there's historical examples of local, basically paper currency arising to handle the transactions on a local basis. And then cryptocurrencies are giving us an immense new opportunity to hold and trade currencies that are outside the direct control of empires. And so I think diversification is a key solution here. Have skills, have tools that you can use to create your own value or wealth, and then have a diversification of currencies that when the whole thing collapses and the conventional fiat currencies are debauched to near zero, you'll still have a variety of assets to call upon.
Charles Hugh Smith, I noticed on your writing and on your website, you talk about the economics, the currency wars, you talk about what's happening in the banks, you talk about what's happening on geopolitics, and you also talk about cooking skills, nature, how to appreciate nature. Now, this is more than just adding some diversity to your content, isn't it more, my question is, aren't you also educating the audience about how to appreciate the intangible things in life? Because once the empire collapses and nobody has any money, it's a good idea to start now understanding that there's a vast wealth of things out there that are absolutely free that are now open to you since you have completely no money.
Absolutely right, Max. And if we've been sort of brainwashed into financializing the human experience. Like everything is reduced to some form of money or debt. And obviously, most of human life has very little to do with financialization. What we care about is our friends, family, having a good time. And so what we see in the local economies, and your readers and listeners know you cover many of these topics, such as craft brewing. And actually, people might mock that idea that an economy based on, microbreweries is not a real economy. It's like, well, then go visit Portland, Oregon, or Bend, Oregon, or so many different communities that are actually making a local economy partly based on craft beer, and as you guys have often spoken about, crowdsourcing the investment. So in other words, rather than going to the bank to get a loan or relying on Wall Street for the investment money, then we're now able to raise money within our own local communities for productive goods and services right here in our own community. So I can easily envision a craft, microbrewery that pays its people in local currency or cryptocurrencies, and then those spread through the local economy, and they're only lightly connected to the global financial system that the empire depends on.
Yeah, there is a trade-off that the billionaire class makes. So if you put a billionaire and a liberal arts student in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and the billionaire sees lots of price tags but has no understanding of anything that's going on, none of the history, none of the artistic content, is completely lost and reduced to a mumbling, bumbling idiot, the liberal arts student can appreciate and have a transcendental experience that's akin to a spiritual epiphany, unavailable to the billionaire. So this is what we need to come to terms with, that there is a trade-off. If you're a billionaire, it's at the expense, in a large part, of those faculties of your mind that give you the facility to appreciate the vast beauty of our inheritance as human beings. Your thoughts?
Well said, Max. That's it exactly. If there's other kinds of wealth, as of what I hear you saying. In other words, the ability to prepare a nice meal and share it with other people in a convivial environment of trading ideas and experiences. I mean, that's a form of wealth that billionaires may or may not access. But we know that most people who are extremely successful in financialization are very unlikable people. They tend to be sociopaths, psychopaths.
Let's cut it there and pick up in the second half. We're going to take a break, Charles Hugh Smith, and we will continue with the psychopathology of billionaires in a moment.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story, or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome.
So
the only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT
You
America.
guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Well, he doesn't really have any taste. I mean, he's-
Seriously, he sent us an email.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. We're here with Charles Hugh Smith, who's not only a great financial writer, but an excellent cook. Now, if you follow his work online, it's peppered with fantastic recipes, as well as excellent insight into the global economy and how frickin' ugly the bankers are and the banksters. And as we head into the apocalypse, as we head into the collapse of the American empire, these basic skills of life are coming back. Stacy Herbert, I know that you're ready for the apocalypse. you're ready to take on the beauty that is us as human beings and the souls of who we are, but we still must focus on some of these other issues while we have to...
Let's move on to these summer solutions. We're talking about summer solutions here. And I want to, so this fading empire, this notion of fading empire, it sounds really negative and apocalyptic and Armageddon and not so nice and happy and people will be miserable. And Americans in particular feel, they react quite negatively against you saying that. But having lived across Europe, having lived in France, having lived here in the United Kingdom, well, we have a situation where these used to be empires, they used to be big powers, they used to run vast swathes of the earth. But what we see in France, for example, is that while they were a great power, the population itself did not live very well. The population itself did not have great wealth. And yet, if you go there now, post their great empire, post their power, post all the great things that are supposed to be part of being an imperial power, is that it was, they live better now. They go on vacation for 8 weeks a year. They have more money. They have 2 homes. They have much more wealth than you would have thought that a post-empire society would have. So could the same thing happen in America?
I think you've traced out a very important trend line in history, is that empires are basically based on concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a tiny elite. And that elite simply goes around the world and skims and loots even more wealth than it could possibly do so in the home country. And very little of this trickles down. And so that process breaks down when the empire becomes too complex, too costly to maintain. And then basically life relocalizes. In other words, this is what happened after the Roman Empire collapsed, is everyone didn't die. It just simply, life relocalized. People's life became focused in their local community. And when you see how that works, as you say, in Europe, life is really good in the rural parts of productive parts of Europe, and it could still be quite good in the productive parts of the U.S. That if the empire vanished, it would have very little impact on people who are making and growing and producing goods and services in their local community.
Right. So the propaganda, however, from the major media outlets, of course, hates that message. Is this why, Charles Hugh Smith, there's an emphasis to prevent people from getting into home gardening, to prevent people from making their own, you talked about microbrewing, et cetera. There seems to be a real concerted effort by the federal government and the local authorities to cut people off from their ability to be self-sustaining. Is that part of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And that the rise of thickets of complex regulations to control businesses and startups, and the difficulty in raising money. But the positive thing is that despite this official repression, if you will, which is designed to protect vested interests, right? I mean, if you've got 3 brewery companies that control 90% of the production, they, of course, are highly interested in eliminating any local competition. But there are positive trends. One is, as we talked about, the Kickstarter type of crowdfunding is a way of raising money and starting businesses that is outside the system. And the other aspect is that local networks are arising, through social media, and basically the internet is enabling us to build a whole nother level of local interaction. And so this is extremely powerful. So say, for instance, if you were going to start a farmer's market 30 years ago, you'd have to print flyers, and maybe very few people would even hear about it. Well, now you can get on social media, ask your network to put out the word, and you're going to have a much more effective means of reaching your local population. Never mind the global population, that's a given. But the local population is also much more dynamic because of the internet.
Yeah, another question I had was that we talk about this end of empire, we talk about a financial collapse, and we've been talking about it for a number of years now, and people say, well, when is it going to happen? And can't you say categorically that when we see things like the mass shooting in South Carolina, or other mass shootings in America, that this is symptomatic of this collapse. The two are connected. In other words, it's happening right now in front of your face. This is all collapsing. This is not an isolated incident due to a regional skirmish so much as a systemic collapse of the entire system. Your thoughts?
That's well said, Max, that when systems start falling apart, then of course there's discord and there's a profound sense of unease and insecurity. And I think in terms of solutions, what we're really seeking is a kind of security that's not based on the state. And we say state meaning all levels of government. So if you're relying on the state to issue you a check, you're highly vulnerable to the disruption of that imperial state, right? Or the collapse of its fiat currency. So the solution is to look to what we might call localized security, and that's based on diversification. In other words, that's what networks are about, not like dependence on one entity or one agency. It's like having a wide circle of contacts and people that you can rely on to do stuff for you, that you can trade with, and maybe having multiple sources of income. In other words, rather than having one job for corporate America or the empire, that you have a variety of income sources. And people ask me, well, what does that mean? And what it means is that you're actually more secure because you're relying on your own community and your own network, not like one entity that's totally dependent on imperial control and a faltering, doomed fiat currency.
And Charles Hugh Smith, aside from localism, there's also globalism. There is globalization. We could see this in activist movements around the world that, an uprising happens in an Arab state or in an Asian state, and you right there in California can participate. You can, help them and motivate them and send money and contribute. How about that in terms of travel and globalization and the weakening of borders and barriers around the world to just picking up and moving, voting against your own national imperial system and just getting up and moving to a third world country that has not yet got imperial ambitions?
Yeah, Stacy, I think you've actually touched on two critical points. One is voting with your feet. And as we all know, a lot of people in the imperial or core countries are moving to, as we say, like developing world economies where there's less financial repression and there's actually more freedom, although we're, of course, constantly told how free we are. When you get a collapsing empire with a lot of repression, your freedoms are constantly being constrained. But I think the second point you raise is also critical, which is we can learn from other places in the world. And, Americans in particular tend to think that America is like the center of the universe or whatever. But in actual fact, people are quite clever and innovative everywhere on Earth. And so we can learn from what other people are doing successfully to build their local economies and their local security. And so this is a tremendous boon to humanity. And one example is what I call YouTube University. That if you want to learn how to do something for yourself, well, there's probably a YouTube instructional video that you can watch and learn how to do it yourself. And this is global. There's people all over the world contributing their knowledge.
That's a good point. I do that, actually. That's how I learned how to edit the Keiser Report.
Yeah, I learned how to edit little Eskimo bears, little bear art.
So I have another question for you, too. One of the major edifices of the Empire of America and our global system of debt it's kind of been, America's like the puppet head, but it's actually like an empire of debt. There's this debt machine that includes the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and other big central banks. What about the role of the central banks falling apart in the last few minutes here, and these new banks and new BRIC nations and them emerging? How do you see those nations and those new alternative finance systems and gold and all these things playing into? Because they always say like whoever has the most gold, writes the new rules. So if we're falling apart, like, how does that go?
Well, Stacy, I think we can maybe start with asking what's wrong with central banking, and the answer is pretty simple. When your central bank issues all your money, then that money goes into the hands of a very few who can then benefit from that money at the expense of everybody else. And that's central banking in a nutshell. So the only way forward, and in terms of a solution, is to start using money that's not issued by central banks. And so this is, of course, the appeal of gold and bit gold, or currencies, cryptocurrencies that are linked to gold, or cryptocurrencies that are simply outside the central banking system. All these forms of money will endure once the central bank system collapses. And so that's our interest in it. And the more diversity that we have in the kinds of money, then the more choices we have and the more secure our foundation, if you will.
Well,
we don't want to rely on one thing.
Well, we actually have a Start Coin, which is part of a crowdfunding community, which rewards people for participating in the network. So that ties together all of your themes that you've been talking about over the course of this 26 minutes.
Yeah, well, that's right. We're trying to blend media, technology, coinage. And Charles Hugh Smith, what finally, we have about 30 seconds left. Would you like to tell the world with this amazing platform called the Keiser Report?
Acquire skills, not credentials.
All right, well, say no more. Stacy, I think that's a brilliant synopsis of this entire episode. Acquire skills, not credentials. You know, a university credential means nothing. Being able to cook something out in the forest with a little Eskimo scrimshaw blade is something. All right,
It's also how they trap you in debt, is getting the credentials.
Hell yeah. All right, Charles Hugh Smith, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure, Max and Stacy. Thank you.
That's going to do it for this chapter of Summer Solutions on the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com. Tell us what you think about some of the solutions offered here. Offer your own in the comments, should you choose. Until next time, bye, y'all.